What if I told you that a message written more than 2,000 years ago is describing the exact structure of the world you are living in right now? Not in vague metaphors or poetic exaggerations, but through patterns so specific and so disturbingly aligned with modern reality that they feel less like symbolism and more like a direct warning echoing across centuries. Across fragile parchment and ancient scrolls preserved through collapsing empires and shifting civilizations, there are words that speak of global unity, global control, moral confusion, and a world connected under a single system so comprehensive that participation itself becomes conditional. And today, for the first time in recorded human history, we possess the technological infrastructure capable of turning what once sounded impossible into something operational. So the question is no longer whether the prophecy exists, because it clearly does and has been studied for generations, but whether we are now living in the precise historical window where its mechanisms are no longer theoretical limitations, but practical realities unfolding in real time before our eyes. For centuries, biblical prophecies were dismissed as distant allegory or symbolic religious language because no one could realistically imagine a world in which the entire global population could be monitored financially, restricted ideologically influenced, and economically regulated under one interconnected system that transcends borders and operates beyond traditional empires. 2,000 years ago, the concept of restricting buying and selling on a global scale would have sounded like fantasy born from apocalyptic imagination. Yet today we live in an era defined by digital currencies, biometric identification systems, centralized data networks, artificial intelligence capable of real-time analyses, and financial mechanisms that can instantly freeze assets across continents. The Book of Revelation, written by John during his exile on the island of Patmos under Roman authority, describes a period marked by unprecedented consolidation of political power, economic systems, and ideological influence, presenting a scenario in which participation in commerce becomes dependent upon alignment with a governing structure that enforces identification and compliance. Revelation 13 specifically speaks of a power that causes all people, regardless of status, wealth, or social class, to receive a mark without which no one can buy or sell. A description that for most of history seemed purely symbolic, because the logistical capability to enforce such a condition simply did not exist in any empire before ours. But when we examine our present world carefully, we see digital identification frameworks expanding, central bank digital currencies being tested, financial systems becoming programmable, and social credit models experimenting with conditional access based on behavior, raising the question of whether this convergence is coincidence or the natural maturation of a long foretold pattern. To understand this properly, we must step back into history, because biblical prophecy often unfolds through recurring patterns rather than isolated predictions, particularly through the documented rise and fall of empires such as Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, each expanding influence, centralizing authority, and assuming permanence before ultimately collapsing. The prophet Daniel described these empires centuries before Christ through the imagery of a massive statue composed of different metals, each metal representing a successive kingdom. And historians widely acknowledge that these empires emerged in the precise order described, demonstrating a remarkable alignment between prophecy and historical record. Yet Daniel did not conclude with Rome, but instead described a final phase characterized by a divided, global structure that would be strong in certain aspects yet fragile in others, interconnected yet unstable, a description that mirrors the modern geopolitical environment of economic alliances, bound by dependency yet strained by distrust. Today, nations are tied together by supply chains, financial systems, military agreements, digital networks, and economic interdependence, forming a structure that appears powerful and resilient on the surface, while simultaneously vulnerable to disruption, fragmentation, and cascading instability beneath it. Revelation builds upon this imagery by describing a beast rising from the sea, where the sea symbolically represents nations, and this beast is portrayed as a composite of previous empires, suggesting not a single country, but a system that incorporates the characteristics of multiple historical powers into one integrated structure. What makes this particularly significant is that modern power is no longer primarily territorial or visibly imperial, but systemic, operating through algorithms that shape perception, financial networks that transcend borders, international institutions that influence domestic policy, and technological infrastructures that function beyond traditional sovereignty. Revelation also speaks of global deception, and narrative influence capable of reaching the entire world. And never before in human history has a single narrative possessed the technological reach to influence billions, simultaneously through smartphones, digital platforms, and data-driven psychological systems. Information has evolved into infrastructure, and infrastructure has evolved into a mechanism of influence and control, redefining power not as armies crossing land but as systems shaping thought, behavior, and economic participation in ways that are subtle yet comprehensive. Jesus, in the Gospels, described a period marked by wars, rumors of wars, pandemics, earthquakes, and widespread social division, not as isolated anomalies but as intensifying patterns that signal transition. And while none of these events are unprecedented individually, their global scale and rapid acceleration are historically unique. In the last century alone, humanity witnessed 2 world wars, the invention of nuclear weapons capable of planetary destruction, a Cold War that brought civilization to the brink, and pandemics that halted economies worldwide, demonstrating how rapidly local crises now become global disruptions. Events that once unfolded over decades now ripple across continents within hours, amplified by digital connectivity and economic interdependence, creating a synchronized global environment that mirrors apocalyptic descriptions of shared vulnerability and coordinated response. Economic consolidation is another recurring theme in prophecy, describing a system in which trade and commerce become centralized and participation requires alignment. And today discussions surrounding digital IDs, programmable money, and global regulatory frameworks are no longer speculative theory but active policy experimentation. Programmable money introduces the concept of currency that can be tracked, restricted, directed, or even expired based on conditions, a capability that would have been impossible for ancient empires, but is technologically trivial in the modern digital economy. This does not automatically confirm fulfillment, but it confirms feasibility. And feasibility changes the conversation entirely, because prophecy, once constrained by logistical impossibility, now exists within technological plausibility. Historically, every empire expanded under the promise of security and stability, offering order in exchange for allegiance, and people consistently accepted centralized authority during crises, because fear reshapes priorities and makes certainty more valuable than autonomy. Rome offered peace through dominance. Babylon offered prosperity through centralization, and each system justified expansion as necessary for stability, mirroring modern patterns in which crises prompt policy expansion and surveillance increases under the banner of protection. When economic instability rises, when environmental pressures intensify, when war fatigue spreads, and when technological disruption accelerates, populations naturally gravitate towards systems that promise coordination and control, even if that coordination reduces independence. Revelation emphasizes watchfulness rather than panic, urging discernment of patterns rather than obsession with dates, because prophecy often reveals trajectories rather than timelines, and the trajectory of our world unmistakably trends toward interconnection, centralization, and digital dependency. For most of history, humanity was fragmented into isolated civilizations. Yet today, financial markets move in synchronization. Supply chains connect continents, and crises in one region affect food, energy, and stability worldwide, creating unprecedented global vulnerability and coordinated response mechanisms. The deeper revelation may not begin with technology, but with allegiance, because the mark, described in Revelation, symbolizes identification and loyalty within a system, reflecting ancient practices where marks represented ownership or devotion rather than mere transaction. The warning, therefore, may concern ideological alignment and conditional participation, where economic access becomes linked not only to identity verification but to behavioral conformity and systemic loyalty. We are entering an era where belief, behavior, and economic participation increasingly intersect within digital frameworks that reward compliance and marginalize dissent, not necessarily through overt force, but through design and convenience. Convenience remains the most powerful catalyst for systemic adoption, as faster payments, seamless integration, and frictionless access gradually normalize infrastructure that would have once seemed intrusive, solidifying systems incrementally until participation feels unavoidable. This does not demand hysteria or conspiracy, but awareness, because ancient prophecy outlined patterns of power, crisis, allegiance, and consolidation long before the mechanisms to implement them existed. And now those mechanisms are operational. Whether this generation witnesses the final stage or another historical cycle remains uncertain, but the convergence of global systems, digital control structures, economic conditionality, and moral fragmentation is unmistakable. History consistently shows that civilizations rarely recognize transformation while living through it, because systems appear permanent until they collapse, and prophecy suggests that the final structure will seem stable and beneficial before revealing its fragility. So, the invitation is not fear, but discernment, recognizing that ancient words are echoing within a digital civilization that now possesses the capacity to fulfill patterns once considered impossible. The signal has been transmitted repeatedly across history through prophets, through empires, through recurring cycles of consolidation and collapse, and the only remaining question is whether we are attentive enough to recognize the transition while it unfolds around us. This is not merely history, nor solely theology, but a potential blueprint of systemic evolution unfolding. Policy by policy, innovation by innovation, crisis by crisis. And if that alignment is real, then the ancient prophecy is not approaching in the future, but manifesting in the present. This is the last signal, and the message remains clear. Stay alert.